Alright folks, let's get started here. So this is my quick review of the numerical analysis part of the food marketing channel. So this was like the first thing that we did right after the second midterm, and I know it has been a while, so I really want you to go ahead and take a look at this video so that you completely understand what we need to do as far as the numerical analysis is concerned. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at this graph and try and review what the food marketing channel was about. So notice all we're trying to do in the food marketing channel is we're trying to determine where the prices of the commodities are coming from. Okay, so what we do is we work our way backwards. We look at what the final demand for a certain product is, so in this case let's say beef, and then we work our way backwards to what the demand for the fed cattle is, for instance. Okay, so suppose we have a demand for beef, which is right over here, and then we have a supply of processors. Using these two, that is the demand for beef and the supply of processors, we can determine what the demand for fed cattle is. Okay, and how do we know what the demand for fed cattle is? It is simply the difference between the demand for beef minus the supply of processors. And what that is basically saying is that if the demand for beef is equal to the supply of processors, that is at this point right over here, if they're equal, then the demand for fed cattle is going to be 0. So therefore it must imply that wherever the demand for beef is greater than the supply of processors, we're going to have a positive downward sloping demand for fed cattle. Okay, so as long as we have a demand for fed cattle and then we have a supply of fed cattle, this is where they meet, and this is where we're going to have a price of fed cattle, and that's what we are interested in finding numerically. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at a question directly. So suppose this is the question, and we have a demand for hamburgers and the demand for steak, and then we're given the supply of processors and the supply of fed cattle. So the first thing that you want to do is you need to find out what the demand for beef is. Notice that a total demand for beef will depend on the demand for hamburgers and the demand for steak. And what is the total demand for beef? You simply vertically sum the demand for hamburgers and the demand for steak. Okay, so let's go ahead and do this here. Notice the same question here, demand for hamburgers and demand for steak. All we need to do is we need to figure out what the demand for beef is first. So that's going to be demand for beef is simply going to be demand for steak plus demand for hamburgers. Okay, so notice when you're summing them, you're vertically summing them, so all you have to do is you have to take the right hand side of each of these and you simply have to plug them in. So this simply equals 10 minus 0.5 Q plus 20 minus Q. Okay, and this then sum equals to 30 minus 1.5 Q. Okay, so as long as you have this, then you simply have P in front of this, and this is nothing but your demand for beef. Okay, so taking you back to this graph over here, notice that we have just found this demand for beef right over here. Okay, so now we have the demand for beef, and you will notice that we already know what the supply of processors is. I have given you what the supply of processors is. So how then do we find the demand for fed cattle? Recall that the demand for fed cattle is simply demand for beef minus the supply of processors. And this then equals 30 minus 1.5 Q, okay, minus the supply of processors. And the supply of processors, this right here, so you simply put the right hand side, that is 5 plus 0.5 Q. Okay, and then you just solve this. So you get equal to 25. Okay, and then this is minus 1.5, and notice that since this is a minus, this plus will become a minus. So it is negative 1.5, negative 0.5, which is simply going to be 2Q. Okay, so that is 25 minus 2Q is your demand for fed cattle. Okay, taking you back again to this graph, notice we now know what the demand for beef is, and then we know what the demand for fed cattle is. we already know what the supply of processors is because we used it to calculate the demand for fed cattle. Now all you need to do is you need to compare the demand for fed cattle and the supply of fed cattle and wherever they meet at this point. So what's happening at this point? Wherever the demand for fed cattle is equal to the supply of fed cattle, you will get the price of fed cattle and the total quantity in the market. Okay, so what do? If you want, you can pause the video and figure it out yourself, but the answer is simple. You simply equate the demand for fed cattle, which is this over here, the demand for fed cattle equal to the supply of the fed cattle, which is this right over here. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. Now you'll notice the supply of fed cattle is P equals negative 20 plus 3Q, and the demand for fed cattle is P equals 25 minus 2Q. So what we can do is we can simply equate the right-hand sides. So this can be equated to this, and we can find what the price of fed cattle and what the quantity is. So we need to find the price of fed cattle and whatever the quantity is. Equating them, you get 25 minus 2Q equal to negative 20 plus 3Q. Okay, so then you take the 20 on the other side, so it's going to be 45 equals 5Q. This implies Q equals 9. Okay, so 9 is your total quantity. Once you know what your total quantity is, simply go ahead and plug the Q into any of these equations. You can plug the Q in here, or you can plug the Q right over here. So going ahead and doing that, we get price of fed cattle equals 25 minus 2 times 9, which in fact equals 7. So the price of fed cattle is now 7. Okay, so if you know what the quantity is, and finally you know what the price of the fed cattle is, how then do we find the price of beef, the price of hamburgers, and price of steak? So all you have to do is you have to take this quantity, this 9, and start plugging in over here. You can plug Q here in the first one, that is demand for hamburgers, to find the price of hamburgers. You can plug the Q right over here to find the demand for steak, and then you can plug the Q in the demand for beef right over here to find what the price of beef is. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. What is the price of beef? It is simply going to be 30 minus 1.5 times 9, so plugging the Q right over here, and then this equals 16.5. What is the price of hamburgers? It is going to be 10 minus 0.5, so it's just this one right over here, times Q, and then Q of course is 9. So this equals